Hello, all. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on wherever you are on the globe. My name is Jeroen Sondervan, and I'm Program Leader Open Scholarly Communication for Open Science NL, which is part of the Dutch Research Council, NWO, and I will be your chair for today's session. Thank you for joining this webinar, OASPA webinar, Open Access After the Transformation, the Funder Perspective. And this webinar features perspectives on the emerging landscape of collective and conditional open models for funders. And it is a follow-up to the May's webinar this year in May 2023, which focused on the publisher's perspective. It's overwhelming to see so many of you from so many regions of the world. And I just, before this, just an hour ago, I received a few stats from the organization, and we received over 760 registrations for today, no sweat. Coming from 59 countries, 500 plus different institutions are represented. And of those 500 plus, 50% are academic libraries and publishers. And I think this is clearly a topic that speaks to many stakeholders in open scholarly communication, as it is shown by these figures. In the introductory overview of this webinar, it was highlighted that when Coalition S was launched in 2018, its members committed to supporting open access for journals under transformative agreements and during a designated transition period. This decision played a pivotal role in establishing read and publish deals as the predominant business model for open access, despite facing criticism for potentially perpetuating the author pays, article and book processing charge, the APC system. However, as communicated by Coalition S last year, this transition period is coming to a close. Starting in 2025, funders aligned with Plan S will cease their support for these specific types of agreements. Moreover, a growing coalition of stakeholders, for example, the Ivy Plus librarians in the US, who recently issued a statement on pricing for green open access by a major chemistry publisher, the diverse group of UK-based researchers associated with the Copium project, and the recently held Global Summit on Diamond Open Access in Toluca, Mexico. And in May, the European Council conclusions for more transparent and equitable open access reflects a collective call for alternative funding models for open access. This convergence of initiatives seems to underscore the need for a comprehensive and collaborative approach to financing open access that moves beyond the current transformative arrangements and agreements. Collective funding experiments, as well as conditional open models, such as Subscribe to Open, in which neither authors nor readers do pay, are reporting promising results, but it's still a minority. How can and will funders engage with these developments in the future? Just a couple of weeks ago, the Coalition S proposed a vision and an accompanying strategy that is currently open for broad consultation in the research community, all aimed for getting to a future-proof, more open, equitable, and robust open scholarly communication ecosystem for the long term. And I would definitely recommend having a look at the documents and consider filling in the survey, which is open until March 2024. What I would like to emphasize here is that though two of the speakers, and including me as a chair, which makes 3 of us, are members of Coalition S, I want to emphasize again that this webinar should and will not only be about the developments around Plan S. In fact, I hope we can hear from and have an open dialogue, giving room for different perspectives and roles that research funding organizations can play. For the audience, please feel free to raise any questions. If we can't deal all of them during this webinar, we will try to find the answer after the webinar. So, without further ado, I would like to move to today's excellent lineup of speakers. First, we will hear from Katharina Rieck, who is the Open Science Policy Officer at the Austrian Science Fund, FWF. Second, we will hear from Farhana Osman, who is an Executive Director for ICT and Knowledge Resources at the South African National Research Foundation. Then third, we will hear from Ashley Farley, Program Officer for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then last but not least, Ross Mounts, Director of Open Access Programs at Arcadia Fund, will shed light on this topic. I suggest we first hear from all 4 speakers in 8 to 10 minutes presentations and give room for just 1-2 questions for clarification. And I really invite you to raise all the questions, the tough questions, etc., for discussion using the Q&A box in this webinar. And if you have to share anything quickly or with other participants, of course, you can make use of the chat functionality. At the end of all the presentations, we will have 30 minutes for discussion and Q&A. And I really invite you, the audience, to participate. So, Katharina, may I invite you to take the virtual floor?
Thank you, Jeroen. I will start sharing my screen now. You should see the presentation now.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah.
So thank you again. My name is Katharina Rick, and I'm going to talk about the Austrian Science Fund, the FWF's perspective on the transformation, and then after what happens after the transformation. Before that, just a brief introduction of the Austrian Science Fund. We are Austria's central funding organization for basic research. We fund all disciplines and have mostly pure bottom-up funding with no budgetary earmarking for disciplines. Before I start talking about the future, I would like to go back a bit in time and also talk about what FWF has done already when it comes to open access policy and development, and also open access funding. The FWF started funding open access articles back in 2000, so that's 23 years ago. We have a dedicated program to do so, which is called the Peer-Reviewed Publications Program. All the costs that all the open access publishing costs that we provide, this is additional money to the budget that is approved for projects, for grants, and all the information or all the costs that we spend is also information that we provide openly on Zenodo, and we also share this information on OpenAPC. We've been doing that for many years. We started in 2013. So if you want to have a look on what FWF spends on articles and on contributions to proceedings and so on, then you'll find all the information online. But back to the development of our policy engagement and funding initiatives. We were one of the first signatories of the Berlin Declaration in 2003. Then launched our first open access policy in 2004, which was back then a strong mandate, but became a strong recommendation, but became a mandate in 2008. In 2009, we had one of the first open access funding programs for books worldwide. This program still exists and is very successful in making books openly available. Since 2011, the FWF is a funder of different open access infrastructures, Diamond Open Access journals and platforms, as well as preprint service. We fund Scope 3, EuroPubMed Central, Archive, DOHA, OEPN, OA Switchboard, Open Library of Humanities, and SciPost. In 2013, we had a dedicated journal funding program. This was a pilot program, and we supported Austrian journals that wanted to either flip to open access or new journals that wanted to be founded, that were founded as gold open access journals. Since 2014, the Austrian Science Fund, together with the Austrian Academic Library Consortia, negotiates and concludes open access agreements, transformative open access agreements in Austria. There are currently 18 of such in place. The FWF will not continue to participate as an institution in these agreements because there will be a change from 2024 onwards, and this is something I'm going to talk about in a minute. In 2018, the FWF became a member of Coalition S. 2020, we started with a dedicated funding program for academic journals. This program is for the funding for the establishment or the modernization of academic journals with the aim of meeting the minimum open access requirements of Plan S. 2021, our Plan S compliant policy, open access policy came in place. And now, in next year, we will stop the peer-reviewed publication program that was in place for 23 years and was very successful in its way, but we now want to change the mode in how we support open access publishing for journal articles, and this is by providing an open access block grant. That means from 2024 onwards, our open access policy will be supported by 4 different pillars of funding initiatives. The first one is funding for open access infrastructures, funding for Diamond Open Access, for open access books and also open access journals. And the fourth one will then be the open access block grant. Taking a closer look into the block grants, what does it mean? What will this encompass? As of January 1st, 2024, the cost for the open access publishing for work or publications that result in whole or in part from FWF funded projects will be supported by the open access block grant, provided additionally to the approved project budget. And the open access block grant is granted once a year to Austrian research institutions to support then researchers that are members of funded projects and their publishing. What are eligible costs? So these block grants can then be used for publications with a CC BY license in a gold open access journal, for diamond open access, for publications on alternative open access publishing platforms. And those costs can also be used, or the block grants can also be used for transformative agreements that are negotiated and concluded by December 31st, 2024. Additionally, this funding or the block grants can only be used for transformative agreements until 2027. So we are taking a step-by-step approach, and the funding for transformative agreements will then end in the near future. Why do we take this step? Jeroen already mentioned that briefly in his introduction. As a member of Coalition S, we agreed to stop funding. We worked together with other funders, and we agreed back in 2018 already, when Plan S was initially published, that the transformative agreements are there for a transition period, and it's by the end of 2024, we will then stop financially supporting these transformative arrangements. For us as FWF, this step makes sense because, as you could see, we have been supporting open access for over 20 years. We are part or negotiated open access transformative agreements for now almost 10 years. And so it's just a natural step for us to say now that we don't want to get stuck in this transition period, but to rather invest in innovative and transparent open access formats and models. When we talk about the future and after the transformation, I want to mention the Towards Responsible Publishing proposal from Coalition S that was published on 31st of October. And as a funder that is a member of Coalition S, I want to invite everyone to take part in the feedback survey that is now online still online until the 29th of November, so that we can have this conversation about how we as a community want to shape the future of scholarly publishing, and how we together agree on how this should look like. Coming back to the initial question that was posed on also as the title of this webinar. So open access after the transformation, how do we as a funder, as FWF, envision it? And what do we expect after the transition to the system after, how do we expect the system to be after the transition? There are different aspects, but one of the most important aspects for us as a funder is transparency. And transparency is important for us on 3 different levels, and I will go through those 3 now step by step. So the first one is transparency when it comes to fees. That means information on the prices charged for services. This information needs to be transparent and open. And the good thing is there is already a tool to be very transparent about the different prices charged for services, and this is the Coalition S Journal Comparison Service. The second part is transparency when it comes to peer review. We hear it a lot, it's the black box. So we want to see more transparency when it comes to the peer review system, when it comes to the peer reviews that are being provided for the different for articles, so that we can see different stages of an article and the evolvement of an article. And the third point is transparency regarding metadata. metadata of publications and in general metadata of research information should be fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And for this, we need to use more persistent identifiers. And when I say we, I say we as funders, but different stakeholders in the whole system, because we want to interconnect and link our information. And as a funder, I see our so as a funder, we need to provide information as well as others do. We, for instance, at FWF, since 2016, we require ORCIDs for all researchers that send in proposals to FWF. We provide grant UIs for research outputs. This will start in the next days. And we will use ROR as a standard persistent identifiers to identify institutions. So I think we as funders can do something to provide more information, to provide transparent metadata, and so do also other stakeholders. So this was just a brief look into the future, how we envision it. Thank you.
Thank you, Katharina. That's really good to see in the future steps of FWF, and it's also really nice to see this multi strategy with the circle, and you have different strands of investments, and that's really good to see. I see that maybe one question for clarification, and that's from Rod Cookson in the Q&A box. That's about subscribe to open, and I think in the chat box there's also a question about this. What constitutes a transformative agreement? Would a pure OA agreement comply? Subscribe to open. Maybe you can elaborate just briefly on that.
A transformative agreement is that is something that the Austrian Academic Library Consortia would define as transformative agreement, which is until now has been an agreement where hybrid open access articles and subscriptions came together and were under one umbrella as transformative agreement.
Yeah, and the question in the chat is, does FWF support subscribe to open? If so, how?
Not at the moment,
No.
but this is something that we can and will look into how we can do this with the block grants.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, clear. Let's move to the second speaker, Farana. Can I invite you to take the virtual floor?
Okay, good evening, everybody. Oh, well, good evening on my side. I'm just going to share my presentation. Okay, so open access after transformation, I think from funder perspectives on the African continent, it's a slightly different thing. As you know, not many of us have signed Plan S or our partners in Coalition S, because our funding model is vastly different from the traditional Global North funding models. So I'm going to give you a little bit of context and then just explain to you where we are placing emphasis at this point. So from a South African context and what we refer to as the research enterprise, we have 26 universities. The National Research Foundation is the funder of government. There's around 93 billion rand that goes into the universities. That's 4.7 billion euro. At least half of that is focused directly at undergraduates. We have a huge population of students that come through the system that are economically challenged. And so a lot of that money goes to the students first. The Department of Science and Technology and Science and Innovation is a national department, and they are our line department, so our money comes from them. So that 9.1 billion that they get, or 460 million euros that they receive, 300 million of that comes to the National Research Foundation. We support postgrads and researchers. What we can't do because of the constraints on our fiscal circumstances and the funding that we are provided with in the NRF is, oh, sorry. We just had a power change, so can you still hear me?
I can hear you, but I don't see the slides anymore. Is that for the others as
Yes, sorry. I'm just going to share again.
well? There, yeah,
Sorry.
there it is. There it is.
Sorry, we have load shedding, and when the power goes down, then there's a little bit of a dip. So can you hear me still? Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, great. So basically, because we have such funding constraints, we focus on a research pipeline that translates students, postgraduates, through the research value chain towards becoming established researchers. And then we fund established researchers in terms of research chairs and centers of excellence, etc. So we don't have the leeway to decide that we are going to reduce funding and then focus on or dictate how the grant is being used in terms of should we pay APC charges, or should the funder then decide to pay APC charges? Because in South Africa, we are dealing with a backlog that was imposed through apartheid, and we are trying to normalize the system and transform to become racially representative. So we've got to focus on the transformation of people, and it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult to make that choice, to decide that we are going to top slice the grant funding and then do something like the previous speaker mentioned of a block grant or something like that, because the research funding is already so limited. In terms of okay, so in terms of where we are in embracing open science and open access, from a national perspective, open science was defined in our national white paper on science and technology and innovation in 2019. And open science was defined to include the concept of greater access to public research data, which then brought in open science as a policy as well as legislation. That means that open access then is related to all publicly funded research. So the statement is made in the national policy on open science that all publicly funded research processes and outputs must be published open access. However, we do note that there are certain instances where there may be protection regarding IP. From our perspective as a funder, we now will implement this policy. So we will drive the key criteria, which includes constituting the national forum to promote best practice on open access. We are dealing with the issue of incentives and looking at incentivizing open access publications. We're looking at the concept of citizen science through science engagement. And we are also looking at federated open science infrastructures. And we currently have the African Open Science Platform, which is an open science initiative on the African continent. And our science granting councils across, I think there's about 14 science granting councils in Africa that participate in the African Open Science Platform. So this is helping us move towards open access or full and immediate open access, because that is our vision. In terms of the continent publications, I just chose a few countries, and you can see that Africa has prioritized open access as far as possible. In some instances, gold open access. So the yellow line that you can see indicates the percentage gold open access. You can see also that the global average for open access between 2018 and 2022 was 49%. and the African average is 53%. I must say that a lot of the African publications are co-authorships with the global north. However, I think that the continent is committed to doing this, even though we can't always participate strictly in Plan S and with Coalition S. So in South Africa, we publish 56% open access. That is a mix of gold and other types of open access. We also use Scope 3 quite extensively, especially in the NRF with our physics and astronomy national facilities. So we are working towards other and trying to investigate other forms of diamond open access that we can possibly look at as funders. But I think on the broader scale, we need to understand that the economics of open access for Africa are critical. South Africa makes up 17% of the global population, and 37% of that population is economically active only. It means the rest of them are unemployed, and 44% of that population is urbanized. Yet Africa contributes 2.2% of the global research outputs. And Africa invests 1.3% of the global investment in research and development. However, African researchers spend less than $100 per capita, or they receive less than $100 per capita in support. Also, the research and development intensity on the African continent is just 0.4%. Research and development intensity is your research and development investment as a percentage of GDP. So in South Africa, it's pretty similar circumstances. Our GDP growth rate for 2023 was quite dismal, 0.6 in Q2. That's coming off a shrinkage of our economy at 1.1% last year. Unemployment rate is high. There's a contribution to global, but we make a contribution to the global research output of 1% as South Africa. Our research intensity is 0.85%. It is the highest on the continent, and I think Egypt is around a similar figure. The thing that bothers us is one of the problems that we have to deal with is exchange rates. So when we choose to publish in commercial journals, internationally recognized commercial journals, that price increases for us by a factor of 20, almost. So our challenges are in South Africa and on the African continent, because we are all quite similar. We have a mix of pay to read and pay to publish arrangements. We do have transformative agreements, but we won't see them in the data at the moment because we signed our first agreements last year. So we will still wait to see what happens. We've got agreements with Elsevier and Wiley and a few others. But the transformative agreement shifts the cost burden from the reader and the library to the researcher and the funder. And like I said, with us as a funder, our grants, which are not the high-end infrastructure grants, they are fairly average size. They're 150,000 Rand roughly, which is 7,600 euro, which is not a lot. And if you look at APC charges in the region of 1,600 euros, or if you look at high impact journals that can range from 3,000 to 9,500 euros, that doesn't leave researchers many options. So you'll find many, many researchers on the African continent end up not publishing. So for those that you saw with the high publication rates, you'll find even more of them that have never been published. So, and there are many stories like this. What we want beyond transformation is to understand the costing models of article processing charges and to look at some kind of parity, some kind of purchasing power parity that allows us to, on a comparative basis, try to fund these article processing charges reasonably. The fiscal constraints, I mean, and for those of you who are not sure, purchasing power parity, if we use the US dollar as the base unit of 1, then anything under 1, you can buy more. Anything over 1, you buy less. So South Africa would buy 7 times less, and somewhere like Chile will buy 470 times less than the US or the UK. This is untenable, especially in the global South. There is a lot of need, and there is a lot of need to take our research investment and multiply those benefits. And as long as APCs trip us up, even transformative agreements do not really help. So from my perspective, I saw the other day Elsevier's article on an attempt at purchasing power parity, which is very welcomed. However, using the gross national income per capita, which is a country's annual income divided by their population, you can see that in Africa, they're saying, if you use this as a comparator, you're saying that South Africa, every household or individual in South Africa earns $6,310 a year, which is not true, because 80% of our population survive on under $5 a day, and 34% of our population survives on $1.9 a day. So that can't be. So that is not a good reflection. Also, the assumption is that the cross-section of the South African population or the African population goes into research and development and is thus benefiting from the system. And a research enterprise is much smaller than that and much more, is not really representative at this point. So I think from my perspective, the research intensity tells a lot of a story. And for us, it tells us that we punch way above our weight. I mean, for Africa to be putting in 0.4% of GDP and while creating 2.2% of the global research outputs, yet I think there's a long way to go. So from a transformative agreement perspective, we will continue to do this for as long as we can while we are finalizing our policies and while we are trying to come up with an equitable costing model, because that, I think, is fundamental to the success of open access on the African continent. Because a lot of people are just sharing their knowledge on the internet or walking down to fishing villages and teaching them sustainable fishing with absolutely no recognition for it, but rather just share the research in an open manner than trying to publish. And we don't necessarily want that as a research community. We would generally want a wider audience in order for the benefit of science to be maximized. So from our perspective, we are committed to open access. We can certainly see how it will help us achieve our goals, especially the sustainability development goals, etc. But the costing, we have to find a solution to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Varana, for your talk and raising the awareness again and the challenges we see with these inequalities and that we need to do better equity-wise. Thank you again. I see 2 questions, maybe for clarification. One from Roger from Spanenburg. Does open science or the open science policy include the humanities and social sciences in South Africa government policy?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And the other one I want to pick is, and maybe that relates also to the other talks. So are researchers in South Africa encouraged to publish in Diamond journals or other non-APC publishing platforms?
Yes, we do. So we are participants in SciELO and PLOS and other things. So we've got the African ASAF, so the African Sciences, now I cannot remember the name, but basically we have a science council that looks at those kinds of journals, that looks at scientific publications. When I say scientific, obviously I'm talking about research publications. And so they do drive that. But what we are trying to look at is other opportunities for Diamond Open Access. So in South Africa, we also have what we call a research output subsidy, where universities earn an incentive for publications. And we are trying to see, based on that data, where we could find critical mass in certain research areas, where we could logically start additional opportunities of Diamond Open Access as well.
Okay. Thanks. So if you could stop sharing, and then I'd like to invite Ashley to take the screen and the virtual floor to...
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, can you see and hear everything okay?
Yes, not in presentation mode yet, but...
Getting there. Okay, it's thinking. Anyway, if you don't know me, I'm Ashley Farley, Program Officer of Knowledge and Research Services at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I lead our open access policy work and have 20.
Is it me or did we lose Ashley?
You lost me for a second. Sorry about that. I don't know bandwidth wise what is going on. Okay, sharing.
At least we hear you again. So yeah.
Great. Great. And you should be able to see the screen now.
Yes.
Okay. And we're in full mode. All right, now we're ready to go.
Yep.
Okay. So I first wanted to start with, from my perspective and the work that I do, I don't think the transformation has happened yet. But I am trying to remain an optimist, and I do think that we can get there, but I do think it's going to take some really hard and possibly painful behavior changes and choices, and I do think that funders have an important role in leading that. And that is based off of what I've learned along the way. So as I said, I've been working on the open access policy since 2015. That's when it first launched the foundation. We were, I think, a bit late to the game as far as major funder policies go, but I do think it was a good opportunity for us to then join other funders, and we were able to do a lot of work in kind of setting what our policy would look like and learning from others. When we first launched the policy, we had probably about 2% of our annual publications were published open access. And open access, as defined by our policy, is CC BY only, and fully open access, no paywall. We do have an underlying data policy, but that has been a major struggle to reach better compliance in, and that's a whole nother topic for conversation. And we've seen, so we publish on average about 3,500 to 4,000 articles per year. So pretty small in kind of the global sense, but we are a large funding organization. We will soon be spending almost $9 billion in funding. So we are very privileged, and I want to acknowledge that we're privileged to be able to have financial resources to use on such things. And because of that, I think it's very important that we do that in a strategic, equitable way. And really, I want to be a good steward of our funding. We have paid open access fees from a central budget. When we first launched the policy, it was very much if there was a gold option, we would take it. That meant that there were several journals that were not compliant with the policy, and grantees couldn't publish there. And we definitely listened to the feedback, and it's always been important to us that authors can have their choice of publication. We understand that often for career advancement, that's important, but we also try to focus on what our values and goals are, which is ensuring that the research is openly available and it is properly licensed for reuse. And something that I've been talking more about lately as we look to the future and kind of what we're setting for our 2025 policy change is I often worry that open access policies are being looked upon to solve a lot of the issues within the entire research ecosystem, and trying to be mindful that open access policy may not be able to solve all those things. So when we see, inequities in funding of research, when we are constantly talking about the incentive system, when we think about costs, that the open access policy cannot necessarily solve for all that, also for the data sharing issue. So really trying to focus on what we can solve, improve, how we can create a more equitable open access policy. I think that we've gotten to a certain point in compliance. We joined Coalition S in 2018. We implemented Plan S in 2021. It was difficult to change policy during a pandemic, although it was very much the evidence was there of why this was important. I will say that I do think components of Plan S have been complicated and confusing to share with our grantees. So we're also looking at how we can more simplify compliance to make it easier, to make sure that our authors and partners really understand the why and the how and why it's important. We've kind of been at a 85% compliance rate, and I really see that actually helped and sustained by publishers themselves. So publishers are very much looking for, funding acknowledgement, that metadata when our grantee authors are moving through, the acceptance system, or even at submission, it's, who are your funders? And like, okay, let's push that to make sure, there is an APC payment or article processing charge at the other side. And that's not necessarily what we envisioned or how we envision the policy to be actualized. So we do have the rights retention strategy that has also been kind of fraught with complexities, and we've seen some publisher pushback. We are now, along with Coalition S, looking towards that kind of more publish, review, and curate. So I won't talk much, but I do want to make sure that we talk about preprints at some point as well, because I think often we can focus too much on kind of the traditional or the more highly used models and publishers, and that's not always the case. Yes, we pay everything from an essential fee fund. I think we're one of the only funders to do it quite like that. And it has its pros and cons. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but it is interesting. We do get to see a lot of the data. There are a lot of pain points with trying to, make sure grantees know the process, to be able to, we mentioned metadata earlier, like trying to figure out, like, what are the papers that we actually fund through our grant system. We don't necessarily track that, and program staff don't necessarily track that. I think mainly because publications can happen so far after a grant is closed that there's kind of a big gap between tracking that knowledge creation and what's actually come out of the grant if it's been closed, and deliverables by the requested by the foundation have already been received internally. We are seeing, we're always tracking costs, and I think it's been good for us since we are lucky to have kind of a large budget. We spend usually around $7 million on APCs. Very small in the scheme of spending $9 billion, but to me, that's a lot of money, and trying to understand, what are we getting for that kind of money? What is the value? What are our researchers and large research community getting from that spend? And knowing that most of that spend does go to the top commercial publishers. We do not fund a lot in social sciences or humanities. So a lot of our publications are kind of in the traditional commercial journals that are focused on global health and global development. But yeah, so what I'm trying to show here in these two graphs is that while we introduced Plan S, that means we stopped spending on hybrid journals, which has been a hard thing to convey to grantees. The hybrid journal nomenclature is not well used by the publishers or in the community. So we've been trying to educate why that's important to us is to stop that funding. This was the first year that we've seen almost a $3.5 million savings on not spending on hybrid journals, which means that that money can be reinvested in other groups and in infrastructure and other models. So that's really important for me to see. So as we stop spending on the hybrid journals, we're still seeing our costs go up overall, though, and we're also being asked less to pick up the bill. And I think that's because there are more institution agreements out there. There are other mechanisms for grantees, authors to find funding. But it's still interesting that even though we are paying for less articles volume-wise, we're paying more than ever because the APC prices that we do pay for are continuing to rise. And we are one of the few funders that will spend $12,000 on an APC. And I think that has to stop. I think we've had a good enough incubation time of experimentation, and we are now shifting how we spend our money. We of course know that there is a cost of publishing, but we've tried very hard to have a better understanding of that. We work and partner with F1000 for our Gates Open Research platform. So we have a lot of insight in how kind of that publishing model, what it costs to sustain it, and what it costs to have their editorial team support our grantees in publishing, and more importantly than publishing, making sure the underlying data is available, because really to program staff, it's the data that is of most value. Publications are great, but they're mainly kind of the advertisement for the work that was done and needed for career advancement. So just to talk quickly kind of on what other models and experimentation we've been looking at. Some of these things have already been mentioned, so I don't want to spend too much time. We've helped to support kind of the creation of the journal journal comparison service. I don't think that has been largely as successful as we had hoped, but I still think it was important that we signal that we are trying to understand this information and understand the value of journals and what it really costs to host and produce a journal. And we see such varying models and costs. It's hard to equate what would be a reasonable fee. We also I worry that sometimes we make a lot of concessions in these conversations and projects because we want to have broader engagement, especially from the biggest commercial publishers. But often that can't be achieved through anti-competitive law or just the nature of commercial entities. So I do think one of the things we are really reflecting on is, I think funders have wanted to be very much neutral in models and business entities. I mean, the foundation itself works a lot with a lot of for-profit companies and industry for its interventions. So it's hard to draw that line. We know that there are good and bad actors on both sides of for-profit, nonprofit. But at the same time, when I look at these numbers and spend and kind of where grantees are already publishing, I do think we have to be looking forward and being more vocal on where we value partnerships and how that kind of gets us to that more open science future that we want and less than kind of our current spend. We're looking at ways to hope. We've done very little support for the subscribe to open model, but where there have been opportunities, we do try to do that. It's a model that I think has a lot of potential. Personally, also, I'm a librarian as my background, so I do think that's a good way for funding the kind of day-to-day operations, whereas I would like to see funders more shift on funding the infrastructure. So instead of us paying individual articles to a publisher, we are using that same spend on infrastructure that can be used much more broadly. And outside of, I worry that our current setup really supports our grantee authors only. There are so many unfunded authors. We get oftentimes up to 5 requests a day because they know that we cover APCs, if we'll cover their APCs, and we don't, they do have to provide a valid Gates grant number. So we do see that struggle, and I don't think waivers have done enough or are the solution. So what can we do there? And more like than investing in the diamond model. So that's something that we are looking to as well. And I will just finish up with kind of what we are looking forward for 2025. So we've had a decade of different open access policies. We've seen what has worked, what hasn't. We want to continue to build momentum. I do think, one of the positive things is we have shown to our grantees the value of open access. Like, they want that. They want their articles to be open. But now it's how can we achieve it in a much more equitable manner for the entire research and knowledge ecosystem. We've kind of stalled at 85% of compliance. We see, predominant business model is that APC. And then we really do struggle with the open data component, which I think is where we can have the most impact in our research funding. But that's going to take a much longer time to solve. And we're not seeing many of the larger publishers able to adapt and help with that. I mean, most still don't require robust data availability statements. So we are working with those that are great examples in that space. And we're looking forward to, not relying so much on the version of record. So requiring preprints, focusing on the early sharing, this journal agnostic, really want to start building up capabilities, infrastructure around preprint review and curation. Changing how we spend in this space, I think, is going to be major. I love seeing the enthusiasm for testing and trying different models, but I really worry that if we continue to pay things the way that we have now, that's never going to shift, and that we have to stop paying, especially for exorbitant APCs, in order for there to be any change. And with that, I will stop. And I look forward to any and all questions.
Yes, thank you, Ashley. I have one, and then we need to move quickly to Ross, yes, for the sake of time. But in your graph with the APC payments, is this including the ones that are published on your platform, right?
Yes.
Okay, so it includes every publication also on the funded platform.
Yeah, we currently do pay an APC for Gates Open Research, but we are looking, that's going to be one of the first models that we try to shift for us to a diamond-like. It's not quite, but we're getting away from it. Yes. Yeah. But that includes all, any per article charges.
Yeah, and I see a very maybe you can answer it in the Q&A box. What is IWA? But maybe you can type it in.
Yeah, it's just the International Water Association.
Oh, okay. Perfect. Ross, I see that it's becoming dark in your place as well as here, but please go ahead with your presentation. And thanks, Ashley.
Thank you very much. I'm just making it full screen. It will hopefully respond to that. Okay, here we go. So this is me. I'm Director of Open Access Programs at Arcadia. There I am on Mastodon if you want to talk to me. I have a bit of a bone to pick with the title of this seminar. I was very nonplussed by it. After the transformation, I thought it was rather an assumption. I mean, the transformation definitely hasn't happened yet, but also is it going to be the transformation or many different transformations? I think there's a wrong tense there. I don't think there will be a singular transformation event, and there won't be a single endpoint model. The research ecosystem is very complex and diverse. You've got different regions, different countries, different contexts, different disciplines, long form and short form scholarship. We haven't talked much about books so far today. Governments, funders, and research performing institutions. It's just very complicated. So it's highly unlikely that there will be one singular transformation event as implied by the transformation. And the other thing is that digital evolves all the time anyway. So when you put things online, you've really got to be constantly refreshing the platform as standards and technologies evolve. So putting things online is kind of a moving target. I'd like to do a little bit of historical background. I'm sorry, there's a lot of text on this slide, but I do think it's interesting. I'd like to remind everyone that the first ever peer-reviewed journals that were networked on kind of this pseudo-internet, in my opinion, were Diamond Open Access journals. I'm talking about journals, around 1987, like the New Horizons in Adult Education. It was available on the networks at the time, including BitNet, CSNet, NSFNet, and NYSernet. I was born in 1987, so I don't really know these networks, but it's an interesting piece of historical knowledge that basically electronic journals were born that they started out as diamond open access, and I think we're starting to return to that. And the very first article published in this journal was an account of adult education in Nicaragua. And in the journal as a whole was really about social justice issues. So it's really a really interesting example to look into is kind of the history of how journals went online. But sadly, in 2013, it was transferred to Wiley, and this journal that was one of the first journals kind of on the networks is now submerged beneath a paywall, and it's done a reverse flip, as what we call this in the kind of open access parts. And now it's published with Sage. You know, it's banded about and bought and sold by different publishers, traded between publishers, and it's behind a paywall. So the interesting thing about transformation is, of course, transformation can go from closed to open, but it can also go from open to closed. And so we need to be very careful of buttressing our wins. Where we do manage to shift journals to fully open access, we need to ensure that they stay fully open access. So yeah. My point here basically is that electronic access to journals online, when it first started happening, was diamond open access. There were no fees for authors and no fees for readers. And interestingly, I think another thing that's been forgotten is that the majority of these early networked e-journals were actually from the humanities and social science disciplines. So we're not talking STM journals here. Now, STM journals, you know, kind of dominate the many discussions about open access these days. But I think the humanities and social sciences should really be proud of themselves that they were in the vanguard of open access back in the early 1990s. And you can read more about that on the open access directory. So for online journals, the paywall is actually a secondary derived condition. And open access is the original natural state. And I think we're starting to return to that now after the capture and the commodification and the commercialization that's happened over the last 20 or 30 years. Also, of course, the author side fee barrier, the APC, is a secondary invention too. But I kind of make no apologies for APCOA. I think that was very useful in the global north to demonstrate that when you make mainstream research journals open access, that the sky does not fall, that actually it's a really useful thing to do. It was a really useful experiment. It was probably necessary as quite an easy way to flip some journals to open access and still provide their publishers lots of money. And it was a useful experiment just to demonstrate the sky wouldn't fall. So that's why that happened. But now I think we're realizing it's a model that doesn't work for everyone, and it's not the optimal model. So now we need to go back to the past, really, and go back to being fee-free for authors and readers, which is the original state of things. So when I think about the kind of transformation in the future to an all open access future, I kind of think about this quote. I think the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet, which is attributed to William Gibson. And so these are some of the many initiatives that I think are already living that future. And I think we need to study these initiatives. I think we need to give them more financial support. I think we need to give them more political support. I think we need to give them more social support. And we also need to encourage other disciplines and other communities that perhaps aren't served by these particular venues and platforms and technologies to feel inspired by what's going on in taxonomy, what's going on in open source software, to feel that they can do this in their discipline too. I've included many different tools and platforms in this slide, so it's a bit of a hodgepodge, but I'll point out that one of those, Image and Text, is a South African journal I've included. It's run on OJS, but if you look at it, it's really beautiful production. CC BY, Diamond Open Access Journal, produced from South Africa, really great journal in a discipline that is sometimes seen as difficult for open access or not friendly to open access, at least here in the global north, because of issues with third-party copyright. So I think if you have a little imagination, you can overcome the difficulties, and I think it can be done, but we need to spread awareness of these success stories. And so here I've got a little bit of a comparison about what I think is going wrong at the moment for really successful Diamond open access venues. So I've got a comparison here between the Journal of Open Source Software and this journal called Software X, which happens to be published by Elsevier. And they both happen to be established in roughly the same time. They both publish, you know, quite a few articles per year, roughly similar. But the Journal of Open Source Software is a diamond open access journal, and I think this is where it kind of represents the future. And SoftwareX is an OA APC run journal with a $900 APC, and it's currently $900. Who knows what it will be next year and the year after that as the price rises. And the thing I love about the Journal of Open Source Software is that it has really fantastic transparency and granularity in the peer review and editorial process. So as either a reader or a reviewer or an author, you just have this wonderful window into how the article arrived in the journal, and you can see exactly what the reviewer said about it and the author responses, and that's so much value add for me. Whereas with the other journal, SoftwareX, it's just a black box. The article arrives in the journal, it's published, and you're just meant to trust that someone peer reviewed it. Okay. And they both have very, very highly cited articles. And I think it's really interesting to point out that there's an article in this Diamond Open Access journal that has over 10,000 citations to it. So it's not so much about the platform of where you put your research, but it's about the research content itself that has the citedness, the citation impact. But for some reason, and I do not know why, Web of Science do not care to index the Journal of Open Source Software, whereas this very similar journal that was launched at the same similar time, published by a commercial publisher, is indexed in the Web of Science. So as a consequence, SoftwareX has a Clarivate journal impact factor, and the Journal of Open Source Software does not have a Clarivate journal impact factor. And, you know, I've got the shrugs emoji in there because I can't really see why one is in the index and one isn't. It's not at all obvious to me. And I don't really see why people are using Web of Science as the trusted selective index of journals, because I think actually its choices are pretty arbitrary. So after we've had these many different independent transformations in disciplines and in regions and in funders and institutions in parts of the world, I think we'll end up with a situation where we have indexes and catalogs that are specifically inclusive of scholarship around the world, specifically including multilingualism. And by doing that, by having inclusive indices like OpenAlex, you'll actually have better research, because when people are doing their literature searches, it'll actually be searching the entirety of the literature, not just the small subset of literature that Web of Science thinks is high quality. Secondly, I think that we'll know that we've reached the transformation point when statistically illiterate, irreproducible, proprietary, container-based metrics will be consigned to the history books. And thirdly, that researchers will no longer be posting on social media that here's my new DM me, here's my new article, DM me for the PDF. And I'm seeing that even today. I think it's crazy that researchers are publishing articles, pieces of research that they may have worked on for years and years and years. And when it comes to proudly announcing it to the world, they have to kind of sheepishly say, direct message me for access to a different version. I can't publicly provide it. That's a real shame. So I do think that most researchers do want to share their research. So that's all I've got time for, really. I'll probably go back to my kind of innovation slide. If you'd like to ask me about any one of those, why I think it's a particularly part of the future, please do. But I just want to shine some light on some of the successes of Diamond Open Access. And I think this is where we should be looking to go to, rather than focusing on the poor system that we currently have that doesn't actually provide much value and is incredibly expensive. So thank you, I'll leave it there.
Oh, I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you, Ross. And a question in the Q&A relating to what you said. So has JOS been rejected from the Web of Science? Amy is asking.
I don't know.
Okay. We don't know.
I just don't think it's fair. I do know there are many Diamond Open Access journals that have applied to join Web of Science, and they have been rejected. And I just think Web of Science indexing is extremely arbitrary. And therefore, you have this huge pressure to not publish in some of those journals because of some research assessment schemes. You know, you only get the points in the research assessment framework if you're publishing in an impact factor journal, and if the journal has no impact factor, somehow your research is valueless. I mean, it's clearly nonsense, but yeah, this is actually also true in some parts of the world in some research assessment regimes.
Yes, yeah, and I can only acknowledge this also from my experience at Utrecht University, my previous position, running several diamond journals in our. Yeah, that's completely true. But when talking about diamond journals, because we don't have that much time, but I want to focus because this is popping up in all the presentations, and also I think as sustainability and how to move forward. And one of the first questions in the Q&A is by Jeroen Bosman. Most diamond journals platforms do not charge fees and are not able to receive micropayments. And this is addressed to Katharina, but I guess we can extend this question also to, let's say, the others. So will, in this case, FWF also commit to long-term support of selected diamond journals, publishers and platforms? And I guess maybe to the other speakers as well, how can we make sure that diamond open access non-APC platforms can establish themselves and will be sustained in the long term? But maybe, Katharina, maybe you can respond on this question specifically.
Yes. So at the moment, we are funding diamond open access journals and platforms on a more so for a certain amount of years, and it's true. It would be the goal to find a way to sustainably fund that. And I think this is what the action plan for Diamond Open Access is for, to bring communities together and talk about ways of how this could actually happen, how different institutions, different stakeholders could provide sustainable funding.
Yes, and Ross, there's the last question. Do you have?
Can I?
Oh, sorry.
Add,
yeah, actually, yeah, sure.
Can I add
sure.
something to that really quick? And I think this ties in with a lot of the questions. So we're seeing questions around like how to fund at scale, and I do think that this is a real problem that funders are grappling with. Like, I don't have a solution yet. I think my first step is we need to stop spending the way that we are now so that we can reinvest that money in more meaningful ways. But when we kind of look at it from a funder perspective, a lot, none of our funded research is published in many of the sustained and already established diamond journals. And that's kind of a conflict for us for how we think of how we spend. Not saying that the money isn't valuable to be sent there, it's just it doesn't directly support our research. So that's why I want to see too more of how can we fund organizations or fund infrastructure that underlies any journal, so we don't run into that issue.
Sure. And Ross, do you want to respond also on the question in the Q&A, which is
yeah, so if I respond to Rod's question, I mean, I think that's why I put on my slide things like OASIT and Koala and Invest in Open Infrastructure, maybe even OA Switchboard, initiatives like this, and Open Book Collective on the book side of things. I think it would, SCOS as well, I think it would really help to coordinate the funding of open access infrastructures, not just journals, but let's think broader than that. Let's think repositories. Let's think, what index it is. Let's think all the tools you need for the research ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. So really work towards more like these collective actions, right? Of libraries, of.
It's very much about re-engineering the financials. Currently, all the financial weight is directed towards 5 big publishers, and that's not a very good use of money. We need to start redirecting that money to a diverse array of better initiatives that really do a good job for the community.
And what I really wanted to acknowledge as well, and that you brought up the humanities and social sciences, and you see a lot of activity there, right? In that area with this collective action. But and your slide. And I know many of them, not all of them, but do you have any idea? So, and I think it's also good to create this awareness, of course, with this webinar, for instance. But how do we make sure that all these new initiatives can benefit from also each other, right? And their experience. Do you have any ideas or plans for that?
I think the knowledge sharing. I think we should point to the new UK initiative, OIPA, Open Institutional Publishers Association. That's a really useful group for kind of small open access publishers to get together and share knowledge of how we do things. Also, the Subscribe to Open community is a really great community of sharing knowledge, how Subscribe to Open works, and how librarians taking it, and various things. These kind of working together, it really gets everyone further in these kind of alternative models.
Thank you. And Farhana, I think you had your hand raised.
Yes, I just wanted to say that I agree with Ross in terms of diversifying publications, because we have become so dependent on commercial publishers in terms of publications, and we are forgetting that we are researchers, and there are many forms of sharing that research information and knowledge, and it doesn't have to be in a high impact journal, whatever they call it, because we find, I think if you were to do a lot of research on the commercialization of journals, you would find that while researchers place reliance on an impact factor, for example, the origins of that impact factor are not necessarily based on quality and peer review, etc. So it starts to question the entire research process. And like someone said in the chat, we are becoming too dependent, or we have become too dependent on the recognition of publications, and we are forgetting what we're doing here, the benefits of what research is for. So we need to find other ways to validate and identify performance, and it doesn't necessarily need to be linked to H indices and impact factors.
Yeah, very good point. And there's a question also, and I think that really touches upon what Russell was saying, and recognition and rewards is a very important discussion. And luckily we see a lot of things happening there. I want to mention Quora, which is becoming a large coalition, and they're forming working groups at the moment, looking at different topics to engage with this. Yeah, so that's a very important thing, I would say, looking at for the next for the nearby future. Maybe one final question. We're almost at the time, but there's so many questions. Most people have spoken about transparent peer review. Do you have recommendations on peer review platforms that enable this? I feel there's a workflow barrier there. Yes, a lot of things can be said about this. I think that also relates, Ashley, Catherine, to the proposition by Coalition S to move to publish, curate, publish, review, curate, this model. Maybe you can, so Ashley, because you have this funded platform and open peer review is facilitated, maybe you can briefly say something about this?
Sorry, what was the first part of the question again?
Yeah, so open peer review, because there is this, I feel there's a workflow barrier there, Amy.
A workflow barrier, okay. I think there's workflow barriers if we're talking about more of the kind of open peer review that's trying to be curated with preprints, because it's kind of the who has time and knows the platforms to go and give of their time to review freely. But through, we've had pretty strong success. I mean, I think the problems that we see are standard across whether the peer review is open or not is just, I think there's a peer review crisis right now and we aren't having enough discussions about it. But otherwise, you can go and look at the platform and you see some really incredible, robust peer reviews that are hosted, they're named. I'm a major fan of open peer review. I know there are some concerns around power dynamics and structures and bullying, but I really believe that in order to quell that, we have to be bold in being open. And I think that's how we truly can see the value that's provided for the peer review process. Otherwise, it's hidden, it's not transparent. I want that information to be able to make more informed decisions on the conclusions or outcomes of the article.
Thanks. We are over time, so I want to close this session, and but not before thanking all the speakers for their great contributions. And also the audience sending in many questions, and what I like to propose is, and I saw that Ashley already responded, so I think the organization of OASPA will collect the questions, and let's see if we can answer them maybe through a post-publication blog post, something on the OASPA website, highlighting a few of these important discussions. And with that, I like to thank OASPA and also the sponsors that make these webinars happen. And if you have any ideas for new sessions for the OASPA webinar series, please send them in. There is this OASPA email address you can find on the website. Please send those ideas, and the webinar committee can address those questions. Thank you all. Have a nice evening, morning, day, dinner, breakfast, whatever you will have. So many thanks, and with that, I will close this session. Thank you.